In the late 1970s, the world of British cinema was changing fast. Among the bright new faces that caught everyone's attention was a young woman named Clara Hensley. She had the kind of quiet beauty that didn't need to be forced, and when she smiled, people remembered it. Directors said she had a natural charm that made the camera love her. In a time when many actresses struggled to be taken seriously, Clara seemed to rise effortlessly. Her journey began humbly. She was born in a small seaside town where her mother worked as a seamstress, and her father repaired boats. Clara had always dreamed of something bigger, but she never spoke about it much. She loved old black and white films and often practiced lines from them in front of her mirror. People in her neighborhood would sometimes hear her singing softly from her window at night, not realizing that she was rehearsing for the life she wanted. By her early 20s, Clara had moved to London to chase that dream. The city was tough and work wasn't easy to find. She started as an extra, standing silently in the background of small television dramas. But soon someone noticed her, an assistant director who said there was something special in her eyes. Within a few years, she had landed supporting roles in 2 independent films. Both did better than expected, and suddenly Clara's name began appearing in movie magazines. Audiences loved her, but what made her stand out wasn't just her looks or talent. It was her honesty. She didn't act like a star. She still wrote letters to her parents every week and sent money home whenever she could. She often told friends that fame didn't feel real, that she wanted to keep her feet on the ground. In 1978, Clara's life seemed to be at its brightest. She had just finished a major role in a romantic drama that critics praised. The producers were already offering her another part, this time an international film that could make her a household name. It was the kind of opportunity actors dream of their whole lives. Everyone around her said this was going to be the year she would truly make it big. But as her public life began to shine, her private life started to dim. Close friends later said she had become quieter in the months leading up to her disappearance. She often looked distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else. On set, she smiled for the cameras, but off-screen she seemed tired. A makeup artist once recalled that Clara would sometimes stand by the window in her dressing room, staring out as if she was waiting for something or someone. In one of her last interviews, she was asked what success meant to her. She paused for a long moment before answering, "Peace of mind." The interviewer laughed, thinking she was being poetic, but her expression didn't change. It was as if she was trying to tell the world something she couldn't say openly. That summer, Clara left London for what was supposed to be a short break before filming her next movie. She told her manager she needed a few days to get away from everything. She packed light, just one small suitcase, and drove out toward the countryside, saying she wanted to clear her head before starting work again. A few days later, her car was found parked near a quiet inn outside of Bath. It wasn't damaged. The doors were locked. Inside were her handbag, her identification, and a half-finished letter addressed to her mother. The letter spoke about missing home, about wanting to visit after the new film wrapped up. There was no sign that she planned to leave for good. When the innkeeper was questioned, he said he hadn't seen her, though one of the maids claimed she thought she saw a woman matching Clara's description, walking near the woods early one morning. But when police searched the area, there was no sign of her. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. At first, no one believed it was serious. Maybe she needed time alone, or perhaps she had taken an unplanned trip abroad. But days turned into weeks, and there was still no word from her. Reporters camped outside her apartment in London, asking anyone who had known her for information. Theories began to spread. Some said she'd run away to escape the pressure of fame. Others whispered she'd fallen in with the wrong people. Her parents were devastated. Her mother couldn't understand why Clara hadn't called, especially since she always phoned home after every film. Her father refused to believe she had left willingly. He spent months writing letters to newspapers, begging anyone who might have seen her to come forward. The police organized search parties through the nearby woods and rivers, but after weeks of searching, they found nothing, no footprints, no clothes, not even a sign that she'd been there. The case grew colder as time passed. Investigators combed through her phone records and letters. They found nothing suspicious, though one of her friends mentioned that Clara had been getting strange phone calls at night during her last few weeks in London. The calls came from unknown numbers. Whenever she picked up, no one spoke. Just silence. That detail was never confirmed by police, but it added fuel to public imagination. Newspapers started printing wild theories. Some claimed she'd been kidnapped by an obsessed fan. Others insisted she had started a new life under another name. There were even stories that she'd joined a religious group overseas. Every few months, a new sighting would appear. Someone in Spain, someone in Paris. But each one led to disappointment. Years went by and the world moved on. New stars replaced the old ones, and Clara's name faded from the headlines. Yet among those who had known her, the memory of her disappearance never truly faded. Her family held on to hope, especially her mother, who refused to change Clara's old room. She kept her photographs, her letters, even her dresses folded neatly in the wardrobe. Every birthday she lit a candle and whispered that maybe this would be the year her daughter came home. Even as late as the 1990s, people still spoke of her now and then. An old film critic once wrote that Clara's disappearance felt like losing a piece of cinema's soul. To those who loved her work, she remained frozen in time. A bright young woman who smiled on the screen but left behind a shadow that no one could explain. In truth, no one knew what really happened after that summer day in 1978. Some thought she might have met with an accident in the woods and that her body had simply never been found. Others believed something darker might have occurred, something connected to the people she worked with. There were whispers of tension with a film producer, someone powerful who had been close to her but about whom she never spoke publicly. But without evidence, the rumors remained only that, rumors. The official investigation was eventually closed in 1983 after years of no progress. The final report listed her as missing, presumed dead. It was a phrase that broke her parents' hearts. Still, her mother kept hoping. If she were gone, she said once, I would feel it. A mother always knows. Life went on, and the world around them changed. The inn where her car had been found was later sold, and the countryside began to develop with new homes and roads. But for those who still remembered Clara, her story remained a painful mystery. And then, more than 2 decades later, fate would intervene in the most unexpected way. In the year 2000, after years of rain and slow erosion, a small landslide would uncover something long buried beneath the hillside near Bath. Builders working on a new project would stop their machines, puzzled by what they saw hidden under the earth. They didn't know it then, but they were standing at the edge of an answer that had been waiting for 22 years, a secret tied to the young actress who had once lit up the screen and then vanished, without a trace. After Clara disappeared, the weeks that followed felt endless for her family. Her parents spent every morning waiting for a call that never came. Each time the phone rang, her mother would rush to pick it up, hoping to hear her daughter's voice. But it was always someone else, a journalist, a detective, or a stranger who thought they'd seen her somewhere. The newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. Her face was on every front page, her smile captured in old movie posters and studio photos. Headlines used words like mystery, vanished, and tragic. But the truth was that behind those words were real people, her parents who could barely sleep, her close friends who blamed themselves for not noticing the signs, and her fans who still waited for her to walk onto a movie set again. Detectives worked tirelessly at first. They searched the area where her car had been found and questioned everyone who might have seen her that day. But no one had clear answers. The car was in perfect condition, her belongings were inside, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was like she had parked, stepped out, and simply walked away from her life. The only thing out of place was that half-written letter to her mother. It was neatly folded inside her bag. The first few lines were cheerful, talking about how she had been feeling tired but was looking forward to a little break. Then the words stopped halfway through a sentence. No one ever knew what she had meant to write next. One of the police officers later said that the hardest part was how ordinary the scene looked. There was nothing to explain why someone like Clara, who had everything going for her, would disappear so suddenly. For months, the investigation continued. Detectives checked nearby hotels, train stations, and airports. They asked every driver who had passed through the countryside roads that week if they had seen a woman walking alone. But not one clear sighting came forward. Then came the rumors. Some claimed she had been planning to move abroad for a secret project. Others said she was overwhelmed by fame and had chosen to disappear. There were even stories of her running away with a mystery man. Each rumor brought false hope to her family, and then crushed it again when nothing came of it. Her closest friend, a costume designer she had known since her early days, told police that Clara had been different in the months before she vanished. She said Clara had started skipping social events, avoided reporters, and seemed constantly distracted. Once she mentioned she was thinking of leaving it all behind for a while. When asked what she meant, Clara only smiled and said, "Sometimes I think about starting over where no one knows me." But she never explained why. Another person who worked with her remembered that Clara often stayed late on film sets, not because she needed to rehearse, but because she seemed afraid to go home. The studio security guard recalled walking her to her car a few times because she didn't want to walk alone in the parking lot. When asked why, she had brushed it off, saying she'd just been jumpy lately. Those details were small on their own, but when pieced together later, they painted a picture of someone who might have been worried about something, or someone. Still, nothing proved that she was in danger. The police had no evidence, no leads, and no witnesses. As time went by, the team assigned to her case grew smaller. After a year, her file became just another unsolved mystery in the department's records. But her parents never gave up. Every anniversary of her disappearance, her mother would appear on local television, asking the public to come forward if they knew anything. "Even if you saw her once, even if it was a small thing," she would plead, "please tell us." The years rolled on. Letters from people claiming to have seen Clara came from all over the world, Spain, Italy, France, but every tip led nowhere. Some turned out to be cases of mistaken identity, while others were cruel hoaxes. By the mid-1980s, interest in her story had faded from the media, but for her family, time stood still. Her parents never moved from their small seaside home. They kept her photographs in every room, and her mother still talked to her as if she could hear her. Every morning she would open the curtains in Clara's old room and say, "Another day, my girl. Maybe today you'll come home." In the film world, Clara's name began to take on a strange kind of legend. People spoke of her as the lost star of the 70s. New generations discovered her old films and were fascinated by the mystery behind her disappearance. A few documentaries even revisited her story, interviewing those who had known her. But most of them ended the same way, with more questions than answers. In 1992, a young detective who had just joined the force stumbled upon her old file in the archives. He was drawn to the case and decided to review it. Using new investigative techniques, he checked for any possible traces, bank accounts, travel records, old fingerprints. But there was still nothing. Everything about her life had stopped in 1978. One curious detail caught his attention, though. A report mentioned that near the area where her car was found, there had once been an old path leading toward a small group of cottages at the edge of the hills. Those cottages had been abandoned for years, long before 1978. But due to flooding and soil shifts, they had been buried partially under mud decades earlier. At the time of the original search, no one had thought to dig there. It was considered too dangerous and unnecessary. Still, the young detective made a note of it. He wanted to revisit the site someday, but he got transferred before he could. That note, like many others in her file, was left behind and forgotten. In the late 1990s, life in that part of Bath began to change. New houses were being built, and the hills that had once been quiet and covered in wild grass were slowly being cleared for development. The locals had grown used to the construction noise. To most of them, the story of the vanished actress was just an old legend from their parents' time, something people spoke about around campfires. But the hills had their secrets. Beneath the soil, time had preserved something untouched, something that had been waiting to be discovered. It was the spring of 2000 when a heavy storm hit the area. The rain lasted for days, soaking the ground until parts of the hillside began to slide. It wasn't a major disaster, but it was enough to cause damage to some construction sites nearby. A team of builders was called in to assess the land and clear the debris. Early one morning, while digging through the wet earth, one of the workers noticed a piece of stone that didn't look natural. It was shaped too neatly, like part of a wall. As they cleared more soil, they realized it was the corner of an old building, maybe a cottage, that had been buried long ago. Curiosity got the better of them. They carefully cleared around it and found an old wooden door, sealed shut and half covered in mud. The door had a strange stillness to it, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. One of the workers joked that it looked like something out of a ghost story. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing above the place where Clara's mystery had been waiting all along. When the landowner was informed, he contacted the authorities to make sure the site was safe to explore. Over the next few days, workers and inspectors gathered at the spot. They slowly began to uncover the cottage. Its roof had collapsed and moss covered most of its walls, but parts of it were still intact. Inside, they found furniture covered in dust, old magazines from the 1970s, and a faded photograph of a woman smiling on a film set. The photograph looked familiar to one of the workers, but no one could immediately place it. Only later would they realize who that woman was. For now, the discovery was treated as an old property reveal, something interesting but not unusual. No one imagined that behind those walls, buried in silence for 22 years, lay the answers to one of the country's most haunting mysteries. And as they continued digging, the story that had once seemed lost forever was about to step back into the light. When the workers first stepped into the half-buried cottage, the air felt strange, thick, heavy, and still. It was as if the place had been holding its breath for years. Dust floated in the sunlight that slipped through the broken roof, and every corner of the room seemed frozen in another time. At first, they thought it was just an old house that had been forgotten. But as they looked closer, it felt different. The furniture wasn't from the 1800s like they expected. It looked modern enough to be from the late 1970s. There were books stacked neatly on a table, an old radio, a kettle rusted from age, and a row of clothes hanging on a rack covered in dust. Everything was untouched, as if the person who lived there had planned to return but never did. On the wall, near a cracked window, they found framed photographs, pictures of a young woman. She was smiling, standing near a film camera in one picture, dressed in a long coat in another. One of the workers looked at it and said softly, "She looks familiar. I've seen that face somewhere." They didn't know it then, but they were standing in the last place where Clara Hensley had ever lived. By the next morning, the police had sealed off the site. The discovery had already caught attention because of the photographs and the state of the house. A forensic team was brought in to carefully examine everything. Reporters soon started arriving too, hoping this forgotten cottage might hold some clue to a mystery that had never been solved. The investigation team began by photographing every inch of the place. They noticed small details that told quiet stories: a teacup still sitting on the table, a blanket folded neatly at the end of a small bed, and an unfinished letter tucked inside a book. The letter was hard to read, but it was signed with a name that made everyone pause. It said Clara. When that name appeared on the evening news, it spread quickly. People who had grown up hearing about her disappearance were suddenly talking about her again. Was this the place she had vanished to? Had she been living here all along? Or had someone brought her here? Over the next few days, the investigation deepened. Technicians collected items carefully, trying not to disturb anything that could give answers. Old film reels, photographs, letters, and personal belongings were gathered and sent for testing. Everything about the place felt like time had stopped in 1978. One of the detectives who had studied Clara's case years earlier was called back in. He was older now, retired, but when he saw the photos of the cottage, he immediately recognized her. "That's her," he said quietly. "That's Clara Hensley." The discovery brought back memories of one of the country's most haunting mysteries. News reporters started camping outside the area again, just as they had 2 decades before. Some locals remembered seeing search teams near those same hills years ago, but no one had ever imagined that she might have been so close all along. Inside the small cottage, the team noticed something unusual. One of the walls at the back seemed slightly different from the rest. The wood panels were newer than the others, and when they tapped on them, they sounded hollow. Carefully, they removed part of the wall, revealing a small hidden space behind it. The space was narrow, almost like a storage room, but what was inside made everyone fall silent. There was a small bed, a chair, a lamp that had rusted over time, and a few belongings that seemed personal: a coat, a pair of shoes, and a few notebooks. It looked like someone had lived there quietly for a time, away from the outside world. The realization was chilling. Whoever had been there had been hiding. In the days that followed, forensic experts studied the items. Among them were several letters, most unfinished, written in Clara's handwriting. They spoke of loneliness, confusion, and a longing for safety. She wrote about hearing noises outside and about someone who had found her again. The details were vague, but it was clear that she had been afraid. The discovery of those letters changed everything. It no longer seemed like Clara had simply run away from fame. It seemed she had been trying to hide from someone or something in her life that made her feel unsafe. The police carefully examined every part of the property, and near the edge of the small room, they found a box that had been sealed shut. Inside were personal items, a gold locket with her initials, a small notebook filled with notes about film ideas, and a photograph of her parents. Each piece told a quiet story of a woman who had tried to build a small life for herself away from the noise of the world. One of the detectives who handled the box later said it felt almost sacred and as if he was holding someone's last attempt to be remembered. When word reached Clara's surviving relatives, they were overcome with emotion. Her younger sister, who had grown up hearing only fragments of the story, traveled to the site to see it herself. She said the moment she saw the cottage, it felt like stepping back into the past. "This is where she was," she whispered. "All these years she was right here." The discovery made headlines across the country. Old television clips of Clara's movies began playing again. People spoke about her kindness, her talent, and how tragic it was that she had lived and died in silence. Fans placed flowers near the entrance of the site, turning it into an unexpected memorial. For investigators, though, the biggest question remained unanswered. How had she ended up there? There were no official property records under her name. The land had once been owned by a local film producer in the 1970s, but he had moved abroad shortly after Clara disappeared. That detail made everyone pause. Was it just coincidence, or was there more to the story? As detectives traced old files, they found that the producer had indeed worked with Clara on her last completed film. Witnesses from that time described their relationship as professional but distant. Some crew members remembered seeing her avoid him between takes, though no one knew why. When asked back then, she had simply said she preferred to keep things professional. Now, with the discovery of the cottage, those old memories seemed more important than ever. The police began to piece together what might have happened. It seemed Clara had chosen to disappear voluntarily, at least at first. She might have come to that cottage to escape something she didn't want to face, but over time something had gone wrong. One detail stood out to investigators. The letters she had written in her final weeks all shared the same tone, a growing sense of fear, a feeling that someone had found her hiding place. The final unfinished note ended abruptly, mid-sentence, just like the one found in her car 22 years earlier. It was as if history had repeated itself. The cottage was later examined with advanced technology that hadn't existed in the 1970s. Forensic teams found faint traces that confirmed someone else had been there, perhaps briefly, but time had erased most of the evidence. The mystery of who it was remained unanswered. Still, the discovery of the cottage brought a kind of quiet closure. The truth may never have been complete, but at least the world now knew what had happened to her. She hadn't vanished into another life or left without reason. She had been close by, hidden under the earth, forgotten but never truly gone. When the investigation concluded, her family requested that her belongings be returned to them. Her mother's locket, her letters, and her old scripts were placed in a small box, which they kept as a memory of her life. A small ceremony was held near the site, attended by family, friends, and a few of her former colleagues. They spoke not about her fame, but about her kindness, how she treated everyone on set with respect, how she stayed humble despite her success, and how she had dreamed of living quietly one day. As the sun set over the hills that evening, her sister said softly, "She finally came home." The builders who had uncovered the cottage returned weeks later to finish their work, but many of them admitted the place felt different now. They said it felt peaceful, as if the land itself had been waiting for that story to be told. In the end, the discovery of that small, forgotten home did more than solve a mystery. It reminded people that behind every headline, every rumor, and every photograph, there was a real person. Clara's story was no longer just about disappearance. It became a story about someone who had tried to find peace in a world that moved too fast. And though her voice had been silent for over 2 decades, through her letters and the traces she left behind, she spoke again, softly, gently, reminding everyone that even after time and silence, Truth always finds a way back to light. When news spread about the discovery of the cottage and the items linked to Clara, it felt as if an old ghost story had suddenly turned real. People who had grown up hearing about her disappearance couldn't believe that after 22 years, the truth was finally surfacing. For days, the story dominated the headlines again, and news reporters camped near the site waiting for updates from the police. Investigators worked quietly and carefully. They didn't want to make early statements until they were absolutely certain of what they had found. DNA tests were conducted on the remains discovered inside the small room behind the wooden wall. It took weeks for the results to come back, but when they did, there was no doubt. The results confirmed that the remains belonged to Clara Hensley. The announcement came as a shock, even though many had expected it. The headlines were everywhere again. Missing actress found after 22 years. The story reignited national attention, but for those who had known her, it was more than a news headline. It was the closing of a wound that had never truly healed. Her sister received the call late one afternoon. She sat in silence for a long time, listening to the officer's gentle voice on the other end. When she hung up, she said she felt both pain and peace at the same time. Pain, because the little hope she had been carrying all these years had finally ended. Peace, because her sister was no longer lost. "We finally know," she said quietly. The next day she visited the site again. The police had finished most of their work by then, and the area was quiet. She stood by the remains of the old cottage, the air heavy with silence. She reached down, picked up a small stone from the ground and kept it in her hand. "You were here all along," she whispered. "You just wanted to be left in peace." Inside the forensic lab, the items found in the cottage were being studied carefully. Each letter, photograph, and belonging was treated like a piece of history. One of the officers involved later said that working on Clara's case felt different from anything else he had ever done. "It wasn't just evidence," he said. "It was a person's life, frozen in time." Among the letters recovered was one that seemed especially important. It was written on thin paper, folded several times, and signed with her name. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It spoke of exhaustion, fear, and the desire to live quietly. She mentioned feeling watched and not trusting people around her. She wrote about wanting to escape the pressure of fame and start fresh somewhere no one would find her. It became clear that Clara had chosen to disappear, at least at first. She might have left her car near the inn on purpose, creating the illusion that she was gone, while in reality she had gone into hiding at the cottage. The property had once belonged to a man connected to the film industry, but it had been abandoned for years by the time she arrived. Perhaps she knew about it through someone she trusted. Perhaps it was the only place she felt safe. The mystery deepened when old property records showed that the land had indeed been linked to a producer Clara had worked with. He had left the country in 1979, shortly after she vanished and later died abroad. No one could question him now, but the timing raised suspicion. Still, there was no proof that he had anything to do with her disappearance. The only thing investigators could confirm was that Clara had lived in that cottage for some time. Inside the notebooks found in the room, there were small glimpses of her daily life. She wrote about cooking simple meals, reading old novels, and listening to the radio. She had drawn small sketches of the hills outside her window. There were days when she sounded calm, at peace, almost happy, but then her tone would shift. Entries filled with worry and loneliness appeared. "I thought I saw someone by the trees again today," one line read. Another said, "Sometimes I wonder if the world has forgotten me." Those words broke the hearts of everyone who read them. It showed how she had tried to hold on to normal life, even as fear crept into her days. For the public, Clara's story became more than just another mystery. People felt for her, for the young woman who had everything but wanted only peace, and for how quietly her story had faded into the ground. Talk shows, magazines, and documentaries revisited her life, but now with a different tone. She was no longer just the vanished star. She was remembered as someone who had tried to protect herself from a world that had given her too much too soon. The police eventually closed the case officially. There was no evidence of foul play that could be proven after so many years. What they could say with certainty was that Clara had been in that cottage by choice, at least in the beginning. Whether someone later found her or she met another kind of fate would remain unknown. But for her family, the discovery of where she had spent her final days was enough to bring a quiet kind of closure. A few weeks later, a memorial service was held in her hometown by the sea. The small local church was filled with people, old friends, former co-stars, and townsfolk who still remembered the little girl who used to help her mother at the sewing shop. Photographs of Clara from her childhood to her film career were displayed near the altar. Her favorite song played softly in the background. Her sister gave a short speech. She didn't talk about the mystery or the sadness. She talked about Clara's laughter, how she used to dance in the kitchen, and how she would always find something to smile about, even on bad days. "That's how I'll remember her," she said. Not for how she left, but for how she lived. After the service, the town placed a small plaque near the beach in her memory. It read simply, "Clara Hensley, a light that never faded." For weeks afterward, people left flowers by the plaque. Some wrote letters and tucked them underneath. Most of them said the same thing, that even though they never knew her, her story had touched their hearts. Back in Bath, the cottage was eventually cleared for safety reasons, but not before the authorities allowed her family to collect what remained inside. They took her notebooks, her letters, and the locket she had kept with her. Her sister said she would preserve them as they were, just as she left them. The hillside where the cottage once stood became quiet again. Grass began to grow back over the spot, and nature slowly reclaimed what had been hidden for years. But something about the place felt different now. It no longer held the weight of an unsolved mystery. Instead, it felt calm, as if it had finally released its secret to the world. One of the builders who had discovered the site came back months later. He said he just wanted to see it one last time before it was gone completely. As he stood there, he said he felt grateful. Grateful that he and his team had been part of uncovering her story. Grateful that after all those years she wasn't forgotten anymore. Clara's films were re-released in theaters later that year in her memory. Audiences filled the cinemas to watch her again. Her smile, her grace, the way she brought life to every scene. Some of them wept, not because of the story on screen, but because they finally knew how much she had gone through in silence. For her fans, it was a way to say goodbye. For her family, it was a way to celebrate the person she truly was. Not just a movie star, but a daughter, a sister, a human being who loved, dreamed, and hoped like anyone else. Years later, her story continued to inspire people. Writers, filmmakers, and artists spoke about her as a symbol of quiet strength. Her name became a reminder of how important it is to listen, to care, and to understand the unseen struggles behind the smiles people show the world. And even though so much about her final days would remain a mystery, what mattered most was that her truth had finally found its way to light. Clara had once written in one of her notebooks, "Maybe one day they'll find me." Not to ask questions, but to remember. And they did. Her story lived on, not as a tragedy, but as a quiet reminder that even in silence, every life leaves an echo that time can never fully erase. Years passed after the discovery, and the story of the vanished actress slowly faded from daily headlines, but it never truly disappeared. People continued to talk about her, not as a mystery anymore, but as someone who had lived with courage and silence in a world that demanded so much noise. In her hometown, the small plaque by the sea became a quiet place where people often stopped, especially during sunset. Some came out of curiosity, others for comfort. The waves kept rolling in, brushing against the rocks below, just like they did when Clara used to stand there years ago, dreaming about her next role. Her sister would visit the spot every few months. She would bring a single white flower, place it beside the plaque, and sit there for a while, letting the wind blow through her hair. She often said she could almost feel Clara's presence, gentle, peaceful, and free. A few years later, a documentary was made about her life. It wasn't one of those dark or sensational stories. It was told with care and respect, showing the real person behind the fame. The director interviewed people who had known her, childhood friends, film crew members, even the builder who had found the cottage. They shared memories of her laughter, her kindness, and the small moments that had made her special. The documentary touched millions. Viewers around the world sent letters to the studio afterward, saying how deeply Clara's story had moved them. Many said they saw themselves in her. The feeling of being overwhelmed, the wish to escape pressure, the struggle to balance dreams and peace. For some, her story helped them open up about their own battles with stress and expectations. Her sister watched the premiere alone in her living room. When the last scene played, A quiet shot of the sea with Clara's voice reading from her old notebook. She couldn't hold back tears. The words were simple, but they carried so much emotion. "If someday you remember me," Clara's voice said softly, "I hope you think of laughter, not loss. Because even when I was scared, I still believed life could be beautiful." That line became unforgettable. People printed it on posters, shared it online, and wrote it in journals. It became a quote that meant hope, a message from someone who had once felt lost but still believed in the beauty of life. After the documentary, an old photographer came forward with unseen photos of Clara from her early career. They showed a side of her few had seen before, candid moments behind the scenes, sitting by windows, reading scripts, feeding stray cats near film sets. The images were later turned into an exhibition in London titled Clara, the Quiet Light. The exhibition drew huge crowds. People stood silently, looking at the photos as soft piano music played in the background. Some smiled, some wiped away tears. One of the photos showed her holding a cup of tea and smiling gently at someone off camera. The caption underneath read, "This was taken a week before she disappeared." That image became one of the most famous, not because of sadness, but because of how alive she looked in it. It reminded everyone that behind every mystery, there's a real person with dreams, fears, and moments of joy. Over time, more stories about Clara began to surface. Not rumors, but genuine memories. One came from an old woman who had worked at the small inn near where her car was found in 1978. She said Clara had stayed there for a few nights before she vanished. According to her, Clara had been polite, quiet, and often sat by the window sketching in a small notebook. She smiled a lot, the woman said, but her eyes looked tired, like she was carrying something heavy inside. Hearing that story years later gave people another glimpse of her final days. Not as a mystery, but as a person finding her way through confusion and fear. Her sister eventually published a small book using Clara's journal entries and letters. The book wasn't meant for profit. She called it Letters from the Hills. Inside were short writings, thoughts about peace, loneliness, nature, and hope. The final pages included drawings Clara had made, of trees, sunlight, and the little cottage that had been her last home. The book became unexpectedly popular. Readers said it felt like listening to Clara's heart, finally given a voice after all those years. Teachers used it in schools to talk about mental well-being, and it even won an award for its quiet honesty. Her sister said in an interview, she wanted to be found, not in the way people thought. She wanted her heart to be understood. Now I think she finally is. As the years went by, Clara's story inspired filmmakers, musicians, and writers. A song was written in her memory, soft, haunting, and full of warmth. It became a hit, not because of fame, but because of the feeling it carried. One of the lines said, "She didn't fade, she became the wind." The songwriter said he wrote it after visiting the place where her cottage once stood. "It was quiet," he said, "but I could feel something there, not sadness, not fear, just peace." In 2008, a small bronze statue of Clara was placed near the site. It showed her sitting on a bench holding a notebook looking toward the hills. The plaque beneath it read, "For those who needed to disappear and those who never stopped looking." The statue became a place where people would come to reflect. Some brought flowers, others just sat there in silence. It wasn't about her disappearance anymore. It was about what she represented, the quiet courage to seek peace in a loud world. Years later, a young journalist revisited the story for a new generation. He spent months researching everything, reading her letters and walking through the places she had once been. When he released his article, he ended it with a simple line. Maybe she never truly vanished. Maybe she just found her peace in the only way she could. That sentiment echoed with readers everywhere. It made them think about the cost of fame, the need for understanding, and how easily society forgets the human being behind the image. Even today, people who hear about Clara's story for the first time are moved by it. They look up old photos, watch her films, and imagine what it must have been like for her. A young woman trying to hold on to herself when everything around her demanded more than she could give. But instead of being remembered as a mystery, she became something gentler, a symbol of empathy, of listening, of understanding that behind every smile might be a story we don't know. Her sister lived the rest of her life near the same sea where they had grown up. She said she never felt alone there. When the waves crash and the wind blows, she once told a reporter, it feels like she's still here, telling me not to worry. In her final interview before her passing, she said, I used to wish she had stayed, that she hadn't gone away. But now I think, and maybe she was never truly gone. Maybe she just became part of the silence she always longed for. After her sister's passing, the family arranged for her ashes to be scattered at the same spot, the beach where Clara's memorial plaque stood. The ceremony was small, quiet, just family and a few friends. The sea was calm that morning. The sky was painted with a pale golden light. As the ashes were carried away by the wind, one of the family members whispered, now they're together again. And in that moment it felt as though the long, unfinished story had finally found its ending. In the years that followed, her films continued to be shown in festivals. Her statue remained a symbol of peace, and her words, those written in a notebook long ago, continued to comfort people around the world. Somewhere, between the waves, the hills, and the pages she left behind, her spirit lived on quietly. She had been gone for a long time, but her story had found a home in the hearts of those who listened, because in the end she wasn't just an actress who vanished. She was a reminder of something far greater, that even when life grows heavy, there's still beauty in silence and there's always hope in being found, even years after the world forgets. And so, the mystery that began in 1978 ended not with fear, but with peace. A woman who once disappeared into the hills was finally brought back to light, not through fame or answers, but through love, remembrance, and truth. Her story became timeless. When people visit the old seaside town now, they still stop by the plaque. Some whisper her name, others just smile quietly. The sea moves in rhythm beside them, endless and calm, as if carrying her story forever in its waves, and perhaps, somewhere beyond those waves, in the quiet she always longed for, Clara finally rests, free, remembered, and at peace.